Section of the course, we're going to be looking at the roots of biomedicine, which is often traced back to ancient Greece. Now, this is a bit of a contested area, and I'm going to be looking at some of the issues within this understanding of history. Now, all histories are narratives, and they're contested. I think it's very important to note that. But what's important here is that Western medicine, at least symbolically, typically traces itself back to ancient Greece. So I'm going to be looking at some of the ideas that were brought forward from that period. In this image, we can see the logo of the Canadian Medical Association, and at the center is probably one of the most recognizable symbols in the world, which is the Asclepius, and it's the snake wrapped around the rod. Now, most people, if they saw it on the side of an ambulance, on somebody's badge, on a pharmacy, they would know immediately that whatever this is has to do with medicine. And they might even have a vague notion that it's Greek in origin or ancient Greek in origin. So we can see that symbolic, at least symbolic connection between medicine and ancient Greece, or Western medicine and ancient Greece. In tracing the history of Western biomedicine, it rapidly becomes clear that we've entered into a charged area where the history is contested. Now, history is always contested. It's a narrative. It's an internally coherent narrative. So we see that biomedicine, increasingly since the Enlightenment period, so after the Renaissance, moving into the modern period, has been at great pains to completely sever itself from a religious worldview. And this is why when I ask people what is the connection between religion and health, they almost always say there isn't one. So this is an active severing that was done by certain people in the secular West. So we have to understand that this division was never as clear-cut as was presented in the history of medicine. So as a result, there's been a great deal of revisionism within the narrative of medical history. And in a sense, religion has been written out of the story. It's instructive to observe how a number of the writers on the history of Western medicine frame their narrative. This framing of the history of medicine and the title of the books on the topic can tell us a great deal. So if we go into the library, we can see titles like The Men Who Fought Against Death. And so this is that typical approach that I touched on a little earlier of the quote-unquote great men of medicine. So again, gendering it male, even though we know increasingly large numbers of doctors are women. Also that this is a adversarial relationship, that it's a fight against death. This is very much coming out of secular modernity, where religion has been removed, and so death is really the ultimate enemy that medicine is going up against. This heroic narrative can actually be very problematic in terms of health. The media often focuses on aspects of healthcare such as organ transplants, MRIs, and highly interventionist medicine, this kind of heroic approach that's very dramatic. They're remarkably less interested in things like eating a healthy diet or walking, because they're just not as glamorous, even though these things we know they actually improve human health and cost nothing, or almost nothing. So we can see within that heroic narrative how things like preventative medicine get sort of pushed to the margins. And I'll be talking about this more towards the end of the course. As writer Mike Sachs puts it, quote, modern medicine largely defines itself as non-religious, even anti-religious, quote unquote. This general attitude, as I said, falls within the larger Enlightenment paradigm, which posits that as we progress as a society, we shed the so-called superstitions of the past, and religion is included within this category. So the Enlightenment paradigm or narrative almost always uses the image of the past as a time of darkness. And so science comes in and sweeps away the cobwebs and sweeps away superstition. This is the Enlightenment narrative. It's also part of the progress narrative that we're moving out of the dark into the light. And what this obscures, and a professor of mine said this many years ago, and I've always remembered it, is that history is not a straight line of progress. It goes in peaks and valleys. And so we're going to see in ancient civilizations like Egypt, they had a very sophisticated health and healing culture, and then that kind of got lost for a period of time. So it's not that we've come out of the dark ages into the light, but that's often how it's being put forward within kind of 20th century narratives of the history of medicine. And this leads into the idea of that technology is at the basis of health. I remember when the Genome Project was beginning, it's always this breathless excitement. It's very similar to the breathless excitement around what comes out, or well, less so now, but about 15 years ago, if it came out of Silicon Valley, everybody would just assume it was just going to be so great for humankind. Turns out that's not necessarily the case. So with the Genome Project, there was the assumption we were going to map the human genome, we were going to solve all the problems, we were going to solve all issues of disease. Now, turns out, of course, this was not the case. We have been able to do it in certain cases, but very few, and it turns out that genes are only a part of what contributes to human health. There's many, many other factors. So in his extremely entertaining book, Medicine from Hippocrates to Gene Therapy, which was written in 2003, Paul Strathern works within this paradigm. One of the characters is entitled Out of Darkness, which, as I've just said, is part of this narrative of somehow we're moving out of the dark ages. Lewis Thomas, another medical writer, says one of the reasons why medical history is not much taught in medical schools is that so much of it is an embarrassment. And I find this very interesting, that the idea that anything, particularly if it has religious overtones, is embarrassing to a modern biomedicine. So we can see within this way of looking at things, and I am by no means saying that all doctors or nurses look at it this way. I happen to know many doctors and nurses are people of faith, and so obviously they don't look at it this way. But what this narrative does is it brackets out religion and tends to view it as an impediment to medicine. So, and that's often how people will understand it, that if someone's religious, that religion is going to get in the way of their health, rather than, as it turns out, research is showing it actually contributes to their health. So it's important to know that this is often the framing when we're looking at histories of medicine. The biomedical narrative has generally told the story of Western medicine as emerging from classical Greece, and as Strathern puts it, replacing superstition with science and rationality. Now, if we actually go back to the texts, we find this is not the case. In ancient Greece, it was very typical for all the doctors to also be religious, but that tends to get left out in the story. So, as I said, this narrative obscures the rise and fall of history, and the fact that, for instance, surgery was practiced both in ancient Egypt and in India. So, today, I want to offer an alternative reading of Western medical history. And obviously, medicine starts at the beginning of human consciousness. We know that human beings have been subject to a wide variety of illnesses from the very beginning, which archaeologists have discovered through the examination of human remains. Trade and wars have also brought human populations increasingly into contact, and so we see the spread of contagious diseases very early on, and you may think of pandemics as something modern, but certainly epidemics were very common even thousands of years ago. And so, so humankind has been dealing with these issues for a very, very long time. Of medical history that often gets lost is that ancient cultures were in communication with each other. And so, for instance, the civilizations of Mesopotamia, of ancient Egypt, of ancient Greece, they were often in communication, including sharing medical knowledge. And so I want to take us actually back to ancient Egypt, because this was a key influence on ancient Greece, and many Greek doctors went to Egypt to study. Now, parts of Africa were in the Greek part of the Greek Empire, and so obviously communications were very close. So Pollack has argued that ancient Greece is actually building on the knowledge of Egyptian doctors and surgeons. And so we know that Egyptian doctors were performing surgeries from probably around 3000 BCE onward. These works were associated with the Egyptian god Thoth, and I've offered an image here, who came to be known as Hermes in Greek. And so Thoth was the god of mysteries, and so these books of medical writing were considered to be sacred texts, and so the priests would be the ones having access to them. So the Book of Thoth consisted of 42 papyrus scrolls, which were believed to have been dictated by the god himself, and covered a wide range of topics including astrology, astronomy, hymns to the god, treatises on philosophy and medicine, as well as descriptions of ceremonial practices. So we see, and this is something very important, that in the ancient world there was no division, that these were all aspects of knowledge. It wasn't divided out into the way we do it into humanities and sciences, for instance. So we can see that the doctor then partook of religion, and so was related to this god of healing. The Egyptian doctors were part of an elite class who had access to these sacred and esoteric texts. So early forms of medicine emerged from this religious milieu and from a religious worldview. And as Pollock notes, notions of cleanliness that we might now call sanitary were developed from a desire for ritual purity in the eyes of the gods. The practice of medicine then was considered to be dedicated to the gods and carried out in their names. The full Book of Thoth has never been discovered, although it is mentioned in other texts, and it is thought that one of the last copies was destroyed in the destruction of the library at Alexandria. According to Carol Reeves, by the 3rd century BCE in Egypt, Egyptian surgeons and doctors were combining what we would call empirical rationalist medicine with what we would call religious approaches to medicine. So there was no division. Each specialization of medicine had a patron god or goddess, and it was understood that the physician worked under the auspices of the deity. It was also widely believed that gods and goddesses ruled over certain body parts. Large temples at Dendera in Egypt during the Greco-Roman period in the 4th century CE were used for therapeutic purposes. At Dendera, there was a sacred lake and a sanatorium where visitors were anointed with water that had been poured over the healing statues. There was also a room dedicated to the deified physician Imhotep. Those who were sick were expected to make offerings to the gods, and they could stay for a time in these sanatoriums. The Egyptian temples also maintained gardens for the growing of medicinal herbs and kept large collections of medical writings. So Galen, who I'll be looking at shortly, one of the Greek physicians, was known to have visited these medical libraries. Egyptian doctors were renowned in their work as both working with the body and as counselors, and during wartime were sometimes paid by the state. An image of the Greek god Asclepius. He was believed to be the son of the god Apollo, god of healing, truth, and prophecy. And so Asclepius is one of the early images of what we might call the good doctor. And so we can see he looks quite human, and it's been said that he's one of the only gods that actually cares about humankind. If you know anything about Greek mythology, they're often very cruel and capricious when it comes to human beings. But Asclepius was understood as being benevolent towards humankind and dedicated to healing, and so he becomes this image of the good doctor. And as you can see, he's holding the Asclepius, what we now call the Asclepius, which is a rod. And so if any of you know your symbolism, the rod is often associated with power. So his power of healing, and the snake wrapped around it. And so the snake in the ancient world has a lot of symbolic meaning, and it's very positive in the ancient Greek world. The snake was associated with both wisdom and with healing. Typically, Asclepius was depicted with his daughters. I'm showing an image here of Hygeia, from which we get the word hygiene. His other daughters were Panacea, from the word panacea, meaning cure-all, and iaso, meaning remedy. And so I want to look at Hagioi, and I think this is very, very telling about the Greek attitude to health, that it has many dimensions that you need to take into account to create health. So Hagioi is part of that, hygiene is part of that. And so I think these images are very, very beautiful. And I think this is important, again, the aesthetics of it. Even just for me, even just looking at this image is calming of this goddess. So Hagioi is also depicted with a snake, again, that symbolism of wisdom and healing. And I had to contact a colleague of mine in classical studies at Nipissing to find out what she's holding in her hand, and he explained to me it's a calyx, and so it's a shallow dish, and so this is where you would put the food that you gave to people who were recuperating. And so Hagioi is associated with these aspects that lead to healing. I've included here the Orphic hymn to Hagioi, so you would pray to this goddess for health and healing. And so let's just work through this. You can see it's lauding her. So, hear me, life-bearing Hagioi of beauteous Mien, mother of all. By thee diseases dire of bliss destructive from our life retire, and every house is flourishing and fair. If with rejoicing aspect thou art there. Okay, whoever's interpreting this is rhyming it. Anyway, so the fact that she's beautiful, there's the aesthetic quality that you could see with that very beautifully rendered statue. So basically the hymn is saying when Hagioi is present, diseases are retire, they leave. And so every house will flourish, be healthy, if Hagioi is properly worshipped. O fertile queen, from thee forever flows to mortal life from agony repose, and men without thy self-sustaining ease find nothing useful, nothing formed to please. Without thy aid, not aid's self can thrive, nor man to much afflicted age arrive, for thou alone of countenance serene dost govern all things, universal queen. Assist thy mystics with propitious mind, and far avert diseases of every kind. Okay, the rhyming's annoying. Sorry about this. Yes, so okay, it's basically asking for her help, right? It's praying for her help and aid in healing, in health and healing. So it's referring to her as a queen and as a goddess, and so she has to be propitiated in order to achieve health. Of Kos was said to have lived sometime between 450 BCE and 380 BCE. He's often referred to as the father of modern medicine, and many healers claim him. I know a lot of people in alternative healthcare also claim Hippocrates as an ancestor, and I think that makes sense when we look at his philosophy. So he was a physician and the writer of the Corpus Hippocraticum, which was one of the bases for medical study until the modern period throughout the European world. He's also associated with the first code of professional ethics in medicine, so the Hippocratic Oath. Now I'm going to be looking at that separately in a different lecture. We'll look at that in some detail. He was a contemporary of the great philosopher Plato, who makes reference to Hippocrates. His writings provide the most detailed biomedical observations to date in the Western world. They also offer causal speculation that is knitted together to form a theoretical framework for diagnosis and treatment. So he offers a kind of model that has influenced modern medicine in the idea of how to diagnose from symptoms and then create a treatment, and also to record that for those who follow afterwards. Hippocrates was an Asclepiad, which was a guild of physicians who traced their origins back to the god of healing. And so you can see right away Hippocrates was completely embedded within that Greek religious worldview. And as I've said, that generally is not mentioned when people talk about Hippocrates. You can see that the scientific establishment, in claiming Hippocrates as an ancestor, has tended to only emphasize the rational part of his writings and teachings. His father was a physician priest at the Asclepion at Kos, and I'm going to be doing a separate lecture on the Asclepia of ancient Greece. And young Hippocrates got his first practical experience in training and caring for the sick at the Asclepion. As I've said, contemporary histories of medicine remove Hippocrates from his religious milieu, and they tend to slot him neatly into the Enlightenment paradigm of rationalism and pure reason. So what I think is very important to note about Hippocrates is that he combined the two, and this is something that that paradigm does not permit. And as we're moving through the course, you're going to see many, many different forms of medicine throughout the world combine the religious, mythopoetic, artistic worldview with medicine. They don't separate it out. To look at Galen, who bridges us from both from Greece into Rome, and it also bridges from classical antiquity into medieval Europe. So the writings of Hippocrates and Galen formed the basis of the curriculum of medical teaching up until, as I said, the modern period. And so Galen is still claimed as a medical ancestor, just as Hippocrates is, so as one of the founding fathers of medicine. And you'll notice, again, the gendering of this. I mean, there's no mention of women, even though we know that women were acting as healers throughout history. So again, Galen is taken very selectively, and so anything to do with religion is written out of his history. So we know, for instance, one of the embarrassing aspects of Galen is that he attributed discoveries to coming to him via Asclepius in his dreams. So this was a very common belief within Greece that the healing god could come to you in dreams, and so Galen spoke about that some of his greatest discoveries came to him in this way. Galen was born into a Greek family in Pergamum in what is now Turkey, and which had been subsumed within the Roman Empire. Pergamum was a cultural and business center and possessed the most famous late Hellenistic temple of Asclepius. Galen's father was a prosperous architect and landowner and ensured that his son was trained in all the elements of Greek culture, including philosophy. And so here again we have this model of the doctor, and we're going to see this occurs in other forms of medicine, sort of the doctor as knowledgeable, broadly knowledgeable, not just about science, but philosophy and humanities in general. Galen later wrote that he shared the stoical virtues of his father, who, quote, spurned honor and glory and appreciated the truth alone, unquote. According to Hippocratic texts, the physician was to be of good appearance, clean and sociable. So that idea that if we think back to that image of the doctor from the other lecture, you know, an upstanding citizen. So all the indications were that Galen would become a sophist or teacher. However, the story recounts that his father dreamed of Asclepius, and it indicated that his son should study medicine. So again with the dreams. So I'm going to be talking about dreams in more detail also in this course, because dream healing is a very common idea across culture. According to Garcia Ballester, it is clear that Galen accepted the ability of the god Asclepius to heal and the broader belief systems of Greek religion. For him, the practice of medicine was one of the highest expressions of the rational, or the soul as taught by Plato, that separates human beings from the rest of the natural world. For him, medicine was art that could be grouped with rhetoric, music, arithmetic, astronomy, law, and painting. So again, we have this idea of medicine as art, and we still find in our own culture, I've certainly met doctors who had this attitude that medicine is a combination of art and science. For Galen, as with Hippocrates, medicine was then a humanities, even though it included what we would call clinical observation and research. According to Garcia Ballester, his practice of medicine stemmed from love for humanity rather than pursuit of wealth or fame. And I do believe this remains the ideal of the medical profession, regardless of certain individuals. And certainly we can see in groups like Doctors Without Borders, or doctors who work pro bono and volunteer in other countries, that for many doctors this goes far beyond a career, and it's a calling, very much as we talked about earlier, that idea of healing as a vocation. We also find the idea of doctor as well-rounded person, and I just wanted to mention that McMaster has been one of the leading lights in this regard in terms of creating a curriculum that takes into account the well-rounded person rather than just high grades in the sciences. Not to worry, nurses, I will be doing a section on nursing, so I'm just focusing on doctors right now. Galen, like others in classical antiquity, did not separate physical health from moral practice, and accordingly, the doctor was to supervise the person's life overall. Living healthily then was a moral obligation, and living to an old age was considered a sign of upstanding conduct. Good health, according to this view, required rigorous self-reflection and moral conduct. He believed that many illnesses were the result of improper lifestyle, and this we can also see why he's an antecedent of holistic health practice. Galen began his training at age 16 and studied under a number of different teachers. He studied anatomy, pharmacology, and surgery, which would have been done using animals at that time. He traveled to Alexandria to study in the library there. He also traveled widely in the Greco-Roman world. In 162 CE, Galen moved to Rome after having gained a reputation as a physician to the gladiators at Pergamum. He had been appointed to this position by the high priest of the temple of Asclepius. His work with gladiators allowed him to perform a number of surgeries and gain great skill as a clinician. Greek learning had long been fashionable among the Roman upper classes, although it was sometimes condemned as effete luxury. Nonetheless, Greek physicians played a prominent role in Roman medical practice. Galen became renowned in Rome and eventually served as physician to 4 Roman emperors, and in doing so managed to escape the various plots typical of that period in Roman history. The picture that we get of Galen is really, I would argue, the prototype of the men who battle death that I mentioned earlier. He was intellectually curious, had a tremendous capacity for hard work. He also refused to adhere to any one school of philosophy, proclaiming the right to choose truth wherever it might be found. Ironically, the works of Galen over time became dogma and weren't questioned until the modern period. So, in terms of Galen's medical views, he took Hippocrates as a starting point, and the idea that health had to emerge from nature and from the healthy constitution of the person. Galen based his therapeutics on 4 principles: the category of nature, the nature of the organ in which the illness resides, the patient's individual constitution, the external causes of the illness. So Galen was the one who developed the idea of the humors based on Hippocrates, and so this conception of health was central until, again, the modern period and the rise of science. And so we're going to see that actually the system of the humors is very similar to the Ayurvedic understanding, and so I'll talk about it when we get to that section. But the humors were believed to affect a person's basic disposition. So if somebody was dominated by black bile, they would tend towards melancholy. If yellow, they would be choleric and easily angered. So this idea that these humors impacted the constitution of the person. While Galen held a philosophical and spiritual view of the world, his techniques for diagnosing and treating disease would be familiar to any biomedical doctor and included things like reading the pulse, observing symptoms, and making a prognosis. He's also recognizable in the way he blended these characteristics of the kind of cultured person. He was also known for his egotism and got himself into trouble with that. And so he kind of comes to us from history as a very believable, you can see his flaws also in the way he's depicted in the history. But again, like Hippocrates, combining the spiritual and the physical together. Finish this lecture with the words of Galen himself, so you get some sense of what he was writing. So, the soul is corrupted by undesirable habits as regards food and drink. In exercise, what we see and hear, in the unsuitable practice of any art. Whoever wishes to exercise the art of hygiene correctly should be an expert on all these things. So you can already see from this the way in which Galen is linking health to diet and to physical exercise. So things that we would tend to associate with holistic approaches to health and healing are central to his medical practice. We have the belief that the formation of the soul is only the responsibility of the philosopher. The latter concerns him because of something greater, that being the health of the body, so that we do not slip towards a state of illness. So again, we can see that Galen is making this connection between the soul and the body, and the state of the soul and human health. And so again, this tends to get written out of the narrative, but he has a very holistic approach, looking at diet, looking at exercise, looking at the state of one's morality and the state of the soul. And so as we move through the class, you're going to see this combination. We see it again and again.